Well, Joel, I appreciate your time, as always, helping us understand what is going on this time in Syria. We'll get into the more recent details, but let's start with the civil war that's been going on there for quite some time now. How did this begin? What has been happening leading up until now?
Well, Billy, in Syria, for the past 50 years, there's been one family that rules the whole country, and this is the Assad family. And they've been really brutal dictators, and lots of people have suffered under their rule. And in 2011, a peaceful uprising began against the Assad regime, and the Assad regime tried to crush it. And that's when things really took a strong left turn because the US and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and some other countries had a strong interest in trying to push Russia and Iran out of Syria. And so they started sponsoring armed groups in Syria that were fighting against the Syrian dictatorship. Now, the Syrian dictatorship is a secular dictatorship. The dictator of Syria is not really an Orthodox Muslim. He's from a minority group called the Alawites. So he's regarded by jihadists as a heretic. And it turned out that the most effective armed rebels fighting against him were jihadist groups who also wanted to target the 2 million Christians living in Syria, the 2 million Alawites living in Syria, the many Druzes living in Syria. That's another minority group. And so the civil war really spun out into a terrible conflict where millions of people were forced from their homes, and the government killed tens of thousands of people, and many Christians as well were driven from their homes by jihadists and abducted and kidnapped and killed. And that civil war drug on for about 13 years. Now, for the past 6 years or so, the jihadists have been mostly confined to a small pocket of territory called Idlib, and the conflict was basically frozen there until literally 12 days ago, as we record this, when the jihadists, the terrorists, broke out of Idlib, drove towards the second biggest city in Syria, and just took it overnight.
Well, there's so many questions about that, and I appreciate that history because I think it helps people understand what's been happening. Just to make a comment, and we've seen this happen again in other countries in the past, where you have a bad situation with a leader, and people want to get rid of that leader. Understandably, they rise up, they peacefully do so. But then you have a situation that unfolds where sometimes you end up with a worse scenario in terms of who is now in charge, right? So what you're describing is, radical Islamic groups, right, fighting in this mix and gaining a lot of ground. And you could hypothetically, even though things were not good under Assad, have a situation potentially where the ruling country now is a radical Islamic regime, right? I mean, that's what could happen in this.
That's the big fear. That's what happened in Afghanistan. That's what happened in Iran. Both of those places were ruled by really brutal dictators before this big Islamic revolution came and overthrew them and got us to where we are today with the Islamic Republic in Iran and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the group that has now stormed Damascus, that has taken the capital of Syria after an 11-day offensive. They're called HTS. But they used to be called al-Qaida in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra. It was the official al-Qaida affiliate in Syria. Their leader is a man named Abu Mohammed al-Golani, who got his start fighting American troops in Iraq in the early 2000s. And in Idlib province, where they took over 9 years ago, they drove out almost all the Christians. They drove out most of the Druze, this other minority group. They killed many of these religious minorities, and they took most of their property. And they've been governing Idlib province under Sharia law ever since. Now, in these past 12 days, they've been putting out messages saying, we're not coming to hurt anybody. Christians don't have to be afraid. Druze don't have to be afraid. We just want to get rid of the dictator. The question is, can they be trusted?
And well, the Taliban said that too, did they not? In Afghanistan, I mean, we heard this again and again. They're going to respect women. They're not going, and look at where Afghanistan is. A year even after some of those statements were made, horrific situation there now.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what you want to say if you're in their position right now, because they're angling to get the support of the world for their new regime, and they're angling to be accepted by the Syrian people as the new regime. And the Syrian people are not an extremist people. They're very diverse. They're very well educated. They're very connected to the world, right? This is not a place where fundamentalism typically thrives. So this is their way in, but we don't know when they're going to show their true colors.
Can I ask you a speculative question? Because it is interesting. You mentioned, up until 12 days ago, right? This happened very fast. It feels like, and of course, we're not on the ground. You have people, I'm sure, on the ground, but it feels like there wasn't a lot of pushback. This just sort of happened very easily, which, why do you think that is? Because that's the part that has been shocking to me watching this situation.
Absolutely. I mean, it happened so quickly that not even many people have been killed in this entire battle in which the entire country was taken over by this jihadist group. The army of the dictator really just collapsed seemingly overnight.
And he fled.
He fled. He ran away. And I think we have to look at a few things. The U.S. has had Syria under a really, really intense economic sanctions regime for the past 13 years. And that sanctions regime, they say, was targeted at the dictator, but actually it impoverished the whole country. Syria used to be a middle-income country. Now it's a country where over 90% of the population lives below the poverty line. So it seems like those sanctions did way more damage than we actually realized. They hollowed out the army to the point where it couldn't even function. The other thing is that Syria's main backer throughout this whole conflict has been Russia. And Russia is a little busy right now. Russia is busy with the war in Ukraine. So it seems like the two things that happened are Russia lost interest, and it turned out that the army was much weaker than we thought. It's not necessarily that HTS is stronger than we thought. It's just that there was this giant power vacuum that got exposed all at once.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, right? It's kind of the perfect storm that made it very easy for them to literally just march in, which is what they did, and take over. Now, you talked about what happened to the Christians, in recent years, obviously under HTS. What is the fear? And I think we know what you're going to say here, but what is the fear moving forward? They take control. You have this, radical Islamic regime potentially that is in charge. What happens to the Christians and other minority groups throughout Syria, not just in pockets, now the entire country?
And so in the jihadist worldview, there are a few different levels of people under Islamic law, right? So at the top, you have Muslims who are members of the community, full members. Then below, you have another level for Christians. Christians are called people of the book. In the jihadist worldview, they're following a religion that was revealed before Muhammad came, but it kind of got screwed up. So they can keep their religion as long as they pay extra tax, as they don't own weapons, as they're not allowed to testify against Muslims in court, as long as they're subject to the Muslims. Then you have a third category, which is for heretics or polytheists, so-called. And jihadists put Alawites and Druzes in this category. And this is 15% of the country. And in this category, these people are supposed to be either forcibly converted or killed. So we're now in a very, very tense situation. We're hoping that it doesn't come to that. We're hoping that the jihadists don't implement their actual worldview here. And maybe they won't at first. But it's extremely serious. And if they try to implement Islamic law in Syria, as they most likely will, we have to ask the question, how many Christians are going to stay? How many Christians are going to accept this? This is a country that's been secular for over a century. So it's an existential moment for the non-Muslim peoples of Syria.
And really a very deadly potentially moment for them. You mentioned Russia, and we know that obviously Syria and Russia working close together before this. How do other countries factor in now? Iran, take us through that, because these are all complicated sort of relations. And we have to keep in mind, there's a border between Israel and Syria as well. I just want to remind viewers and listeners of that. And that's a whole other situation. But how do the other countries around factor in here?
I think actually the most important country to look at is Turkey. Turkey was giving some sort of unofficial protection to HTS in Idlib province. It was Turkey that kept the Syrian government from going all the way and destroying HTS 4 years ago when they wanted to do this. And it's almost certainly with Turkey's approval and foreknowledge that HTS launched this whole assault. So Turkey is really trying to expand its influence in Syria. They're making a move for Syria. Many Turks even see Syria as their traditional land. It used to be part of their empire. They want it back. And as your viewers will know, Billy, because you've been talking about this so much, Turkey is also fresh from destroying the ancient Christian community of Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh. So we're really seeing Turkey is expanding its power and its influence in all these directions, and usually at the expense of the ancient Christian communities of the greater Middle East. I don't know if US decision makers are fully aware of what's happening, that they're really enabling the rise of Turkey while they're distracted with Iran and Russia and some other things. But this is going to fundamentally change the balance of power in the region, and it won't be good for Israel. It won't be good for the Christians. It won't be good for anyone except Turkey, really.
You know, final question for you here, because we also have a major shift of power that's about to take place in the world, but in particular in America, with Biden leaving. And I mean, we're talking in weeks here, and former President Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump coming in. What would be your warning, caution, advice to Trump as he comes into this situation in light of this particular circumstance?
I would say to President-elect Trump, when he was president the last time, he actually cut off U.S. support for groups like HTS for a time, because I think he recognized what a bad idea that was. And I would say to him, look, these guys are now in the driver's seat in Syria. They're about to be in the driver's seat in the whole region. And the U.S. still has some influence there. They have influence with Turkey. They have influence with Saudi Arabia. They probably have influence with HTS itself. So he said recently that he doesn't think it's America's job to be involved in Syria. I would say to him, consider the fact that you're already quite involved, and consider how that involvement can be positive. Trump has the chance now to keep Christianity from disappearing in Syria and probably the whole Middle East. I would say, think about it, reflect on it, reflect on your legacy, and have mercy on the people of Syria.
Joel, where can people go? You know, you're with Christian Solidarity International. What website can they go to? You guys have great alerts, information on all of this and other crises going on around the world. What is the best website for people to visit?
Absolutely. Our website in the US is www.csi-usa.org. And we're financed entirely by contributions from small donors. And we're so grateful for any support we can get, even if that's just praying. We really need people to pray now for the Christians of Syria, for all the people of Syria.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Billy.